Welcome, everybody. It's great to see old faces, new faces. I'm Susan Wolf, professor of law and medicine at the University of Minnesota, and together with my colleague Tim Pruitt, I lead the ethics and public policy component of the ATP-Bio ERC. I'd like to welcome everybody to today's ATP-Bio public webinar series. Um, Today's webinar is part of the ethics and public policy component series of presentations in this webinar, and we're really delighted today to have Professor Andrew Maynard of Arizona State University with us to present on successfully bridging innovation and application, exploring a risk innovation approach to developing and using advanced biopreservation technologies. Andrew is part of the Ethics and Public Policy Panel, EP3, which is really core to the work of the Ethics and Public Policy component. There are 13 highly expert members of the panel. Professor Maynard is one, and we've got others with us today. And they, together with many people within ATP-Bio and other experts, have contributed to a 10-article symposium that is forthcoming soon in the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics on emerging technologies to stop biological time, the ethical, legal, and policy challenges of advanced biopreservation. As part of that symposium, Dr. Maynard led a series of IRB-approved workshops with ATP-Bio industry, nonprofit, and other partners to explore what they saw as the values that ATP biotechnologies could advance and what they saw as potential threats to those values. I see Tim Tripp with us today, who was another leader of that project. I was a co-author. So we've got a great group here to talk about what we uncovered through those workshops. This is a highly innovative approach to stakeholder engagement and risk analysis that Andrew and his colleagues have pioneered, so we're delighted to talk about that today. By way of a very brief introduction, because I know you want to get to the presentation, Dr. Andrew Maynard is a professor of advanced technology transitions in the ASU School for the Future of Innovation in Society. His own research focuses on successfully transitioning to a future where a whole range of transformative technologies have the power to fundamentally change every aspect of society. And Dr. Maynard and I have no relevant disclosures beyond the fact that this event is, of course, supported by the NSF ERC's grant, number EC 1941543. So Dr. Maynard will present for about 30 or 35 minutes. We'll then move to QA, and I'll ask you to use the raise hand function so I can recognize you. As you know, the event is being live streamed on Zoom. It's also being recorded and will be available on the ATP-Bio website for asynchronous viewing for those who can't be with us today. It's now my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Andrew Maynard.
Susan, thank you so much for that, as always, kind introduction. Just give me a second while I pull my slides up here. And does that look okay? Hopefully the Zoom gods are working here. So just getting into this, this is a long title, so I want to at least sort of give you the précis before I start off here. And so this was an exercise in asking, what are the potential unexpected barriers to really realizing the value of some really quite transformative advances in biopreservation technologies? and how both as developers and researchers and society as a whole, can we navigate those unexpected barriers to really realize the benefits of these technologies? So that's the big picture. And I'm going to take you through this paper that Susan mentioned that gives you a sense of what we did and what the outcomes were. But I also want to start off with a broader set of framings around why we're asking these questions in the first place and the framework within which we're approaching this. Before that, though, I need to start off adding my own disclosure and acknowledgement. So as Susan said, I have no relevant disclosures here. I'm also a member of the ATP Bioethics and Public Policy panel. And I also want to add to the acknowledgements here that not only does this research draw on research that's supported through the National Science Foundation Engineering Research Center for Advanced Technologies for the Preservation of Biological Systems, ATP-Bio, but also it's really a joint effort between myself and my colleagues, Melissa Scragg here at ASU, Ken Oy at MIT, who I believe is also on the call, Tim Tripp, and Susan. So without further ado, I just want to start off talking very, very briefly about advanced biopreservation technologies. And most people on the call will understand this framing, but just for the sake of completeness, we're looking at technologies here that, certainly in the words of some of the work we've been involved with, are technologies that pause biological time, that effectively extend the usable time of biological systems, whether that's extending the usable time window of an organ for organ transplants or other biological material, whether it's extending the time within which biological samples like seeds are viable, or even other parts of biological ecosystems. And this, it's important research. It's also transformative research, because if we can extend that biological time window within which things are viable, we can transform so many systems that we work within. So this is an initiative that really focuses on three key areas. First of all, human health. Obviously, you're looking at tissue samples and organs. Food systems, where you're looking at preserving and extending the life of very diverse food items and food products within those systems, but also biodiversity. How do we protect the biodiversity of the systems, the ecosystems we're a part of, especially at a time when they're under threat? And how can we use this concept of pausing biological time to do this? So this is important for two reasons. First of all, you can see fairly intuitively that there is significant potential value to society for doing this. You just take the area of human health and think, if we can extend the potential usability window of, say, heart for transplantation from a few hours to a few days or few weeks, it transforms the availability of hearts for transplants, potentially transforms lives. So it seemed like a no-brainer. Why wouldn't we do this? Why wouldn't society accept these technologies? What could possibly be a barrier to their success? The reality, though, is that, as with any technology, it's being developed in a very complex socio-technological system, which means that even though we think the technology is fantastic, it's going to create value for society, there are incredibly complex threats to that value realization. And with any technology development like this, if we don't understand the nature of that threat landscape, it is very, very hard to successfully see the positive results of that technology. So this is where we were starting off with these biopreservation technologies, and asking this very specific question. How can the societal value of advanced biopreservation technologies be realized within a highly complex social, technological, and governance or regulatory ecosystem? It's a question to which actually there are very, very few answers at the moment. And so we were beginning to look around to understand how we can begin to approach this really complex question. And one of the possibilities was drawing on our research on risk innovation, which I'll describe in a second, which reframes risk as a threat to value. And I have to qualify this by saying that if there are any risk experts in the audience, you're probably rolling your eyes now, thinking that this is a really bad definition of risk, because risk is all about the probability of harm, so you can actually work out how to reduce that probability. And calling it a threat to value feels a little bit like the slippery slope of conflating risk and hazard. However, as it turns out, beginning to think in a qualitative way as risk as a threat to value opens up avenues of understanding risk and navigating it that aren't available from conventional understanding of risk. And this is part of our research around the field of risk innovation. This is a very, very sort of loose area, but essentially the definition of risk innovation is a way of approaching risk that leads to new knowledge, understanding, and capabilities, and that translates these into products, tools, or practices that protect and grow societal, environmental, economic, and other value. So the key things here are the idea of this being generative, that risk innovation is all about generating new knowledge and understanding, but more specifically, generating specific approaches and capabilities that allow either value to be protected or value to be grown. And so this is where this idea of threat to value becomes so important in this ecosystem of understanding risk. And essentially, our approach to this, we have a methodology that's been developed over several years. And it was a methodology that started off asking the question, if we had 30 minutes with the founder of a tech startup who really wanted to change the world in positive ways, but really hadn't got the foggiest how to do this, what sort of process would we take them through in 30 minutes, which would give them a new set of understanding and options for really succeeding? And we did this through a framework of thinking about both the enterprise and a key set of stakeholders. So you start off with the enterprise that when we started would have been a startup, but it's extending out now to research programs, businesses, and other organizations. And then we ask, how do they fit in with an ecosystem of 3 different categories of stakeholders: investors, consumers, and communities? And we do this because that then allows you to understand a complex system of value protection, and value growth. The value that the enterprise is trying to grow, the value that it's important to key stakeholders, and how you ensure that everybody feels that they're seeing value growth and value respect within this. And that's where the idea of threat comes in. But before that, I do need to say something about the distinction between value and values, because it's a subtle distinction, but an important one. So when we approach this, we started off thinking about values, what's important to these stakeholders in the enterprise. But the trouble is, if you talk about values in terms of principles or beliefs that guide behavior and decision making, they're not quantifiable, which means they're important, but you can't build an operational strategy around them that easily. So instead, we started looking at the idea of value. In other words, the worth or utility of something. And that might be money. It might be sort of personal utility. It might be social or environmental utility. But the point here is that unlike values, value is quantifiable because it's something concrete that someone or an entity stands to either lose or gain. And because of that, we can start using it in a risk framing. So you get back to this and you begin to ask about threats. As soon as we've got this idea of value as something that's important, we can begin to ask what might threaten the value that, say, an enterprise is trying to build, or the value that is held dear by different stakeholders. Because if you can understand where the opportunities and threats are in terms of value, you can work out how to begin to navigate around them. So another way of looking at this is a feedback loop where you have the enterprise and you have key stakeholders. The enterprise carries out actions. If those actions are threats to stakeholder value, they will create barriers to success. Similarly, if those stakeholders have certain behaviors that are governed by what is of value to them that threaten enterprise success, the enterprise needs to be aware of that so it can actually navigate through this landscape. So this is at the heart of our approach to risk innovation. When we started this early on, we started thinking about risk landscapes, and this was one of our early sort of ways of capturing this. The idea is that if you're an enterprise, you're starting somewhere, you're trying to get somewhere else, and in between where you are now and where you want to be in the future, there are all sorts of things that are going to sort of block you, sort of steer you in different directions. You've got to navigate around. And we were asking the question, what are these things that people aren't thinking about that they nevertheless have to be aware of? And in doing this, it became fairly clear that enterprises are pretty good at dealing with conventional risk, asking, is something going to kill you or otherwise harm your health? Is it going to harm the environment? Is it going to create a financial risk? We have systems for doing that. We don't have systems for dealing with a lot of the more social and qualitative risks that organizations face and that tend to be ignored as a result, but nevertheless can actually make the difference between success or failure. So we ended up calling these orphan risks. And this is where these slides get a little busy. I'm going to apologize for that now, but there's a reason for this, and you'll see that as we go along. So in developing this approach, we identified 18 orphan risks. These aren't the only orphan risks out there, but they create a framework which is useful to thinking about the things that could be a barrier to success that are often ignored. And you can see this. A lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them are societal or governance related, such as reputation and trust, or ethics, or social trends, or the potential loss of agency that a certain set of actions will take. And I put these up because these are at the core of a process that we go through, and the process that we went through in this research to try and understand what the risk landscape is like around advanced biopreservation technologies. So from that, you go on to the very specific framework that we were looking at. So I talked about the concept of risk innovation. That was developed into what we refer to as the Risk Innovation Nexus, which is a practice-based initiative to try and help organizations understand what their orphan risk landscape is like and how to rely on that to make informed and pragmatic decisions around where they're trying to go. And so if you're interested, this is the website, riskinnovation.org. And there we have a bunch of resources, including very practical resources as well as training modules. And just to give you a sense of a couple of those, and these are important for the research we carried out. One of the central things I mentioned earlier that we set out asking if we had 30 minutes with a founder, what would we do? That led to what we recall the Risk Innovation Planner, which is simply a two-page document that takes them through a process of thinking about who their stakeholders are, where the potential areas of value are to them and their stakeholders, where the potential threats are, and how they can think about overcoming those. It's a very, very subjective exercise that is designed to get people thinking. And then on the right, you can see some of the cards that we use when we're working with organizations that highlight some of these orphan risks and give a broader description of them. But moving on, so this is the framing that we went into this piece of research with. And as I said, we developed this to work in a very subjective way with startups and businesses. But the question we were faced with is, with the development of a transforming suite of technologies, such as advanced biopreservation technologies, is there a way of applying this framework and this technique all the way from researchers and developers to implementers that will help them understand in a more useful way what this risk landscape looks like so that they can make informed decisions all the way from development to implementation with how they ensure the success and the societal success of these technologies. So this is the paper that Susan mentioned, which is coming out very shortly with the very long and convoluted title, Successfully Bridging Innovation and Application. I'm not going to read it all out. And I want to just walk you through what we did with this, why we did the work, what some of the key findings were. So we started off with 3 aims, and they were fairly simple aims. The first one was simply to assess the utility of the risk innovation approach in supporting the development of beneficial and successful advanced biopreservation technologies, simply because this was the first time anybody had tried to take this sort of approach and apply it across the board to the development of an advanced technology, specifically within the context of something like an engineering research center. We then very specifically wanted to see whether we could develop an understanding of the perceived risk landscape in the 3 areas that ATP-Bio focuses on: food systems, human health, and biodiversity. And then we wanted to open things up again and ask more broadly what the usefulness for risk innovation approach is to other domains of emerging technologies. So a fairly basic set of aims. We approach these in a fairly specific way. We, first of all, turned to the group of partners of ATP-Bio that are really at the sharp edge of taking research and implementing it in very practical situations. We felt that these really would have the greatest insights into what this value-based landscape is like associated with key stakeholders. To do this, we convened 3 90-minute curated workshops, and this is where we were collecting data. Each of the 3 workshops focus on one of the 3 different areas: food systems, human health, and biodiversity. As Susan mentioned, this was all overseen by IRB approval, both from University of Minnesota and Arizona State University. And the idea was to see whether this was a model where we could take a fairly diverse group of stakeholders and pull them together, take them through a process, and develop insights into what this risk landscape looked like. The specific method looks something like this. So before the workshop, all the participants had a set of readings on risk innovation and associated materials with that, a lot of them coming from the website that I showed you. So at least they were primed going into the workshop. And then when we started the workshop, and I should say that this was really curated and developed by my colleague, Marissa Scragg, we started off with a fresh introduction to risk innovation. So everybody in the workshop had a sense of what they were doing and what this framework was. We then asked them to identify who they thought were the key stakeholders within the particular advanced biopreservation technologies ecosystem they were working with. For those stakeholders, we then asked them to identify enterprise and stakeholder areas of value. So here it's important to say that these weren't absolute areas of value. These were perceived areas of value that were important to the people participating. And this is all part of the process. It's not about what is real, but what is perceived to be real. So we asked them to identify in their mind where they thought the key areas of value were. We then introduced them to this concept of orphan risks, the hidden risks that might otherwise prevent that value retention or value growth. And once they'd done that, so they got areas of value and an understanding of orphan risks, we asked them to align those areas of value with the orphan risks. So you began to develop this almost a crowdsourced from the workshop idea of what the risk landscape might look like. And then obviously we sat down and analyzed the data. What did the results look like? I'm just going to get to that. But first of all, a warning. I do a lot of presentations, and I talk a lot about good presentation practice and bad presentation practice. And I'm about to indulge in some very bad presentation practice in that these slides are very busy indeed, because it was the only way we could really represent data. But I would say going into this, please don't panic, because I'm going to highlight what I think is important on these slides. But it also means that if you're coming back to look at these, at least you've got the richness of the information here. Okay, first of all, this is not a busy slide. This is a fairly straightforward slide just to give you a sense of what we were looking at with the workshops. The N here is load. So food systems, we only had 4 participants, maxed out at 8 in human health. And overall, there were 17 participants representing 16 ATP-Bio partners. So there was one partner that sent people to a couple of these. The numbers actually aren't that important here because it was the process that was important. And you'll see this as we go through. Okay, getting a little bit more busy here. And I'll pick out some of these. So when you begin to look at identified areas of value, this is what the data looked like. So in each of these 3 areas, human health, food systems, and biodiversity, we asked people to just select a few key areas of value that they thought were important for the enterprise, for investors, for customers, and for communities. And the process was we went through a fairly sort of open-ended process with this. Then afterwards, we pulled out what we thought from that process were the key areas of value. So these are a synthesis of the workshop. And I just want to highlight a few of these to give you a sense of what we started seeing in this. And this is important because if you look at these highlighted areas, you could actually look at this and say, those are obvious. Surely everybody knows, for instance, that if you are an enterprise focused on advanced biopreservation technologies and human health, of course you want to improve lives. Apart from the fact that without a process like this, that remains tacit and nobody really puts it into the decision-making process. So you look at the areas I've highlighted. In human health, we began to see areas of value such as improved lives, investors' return on investment, really important that this came out. But also you look there, and this is not highlighted in human health, This idea of trustworthiness and social responsibility people thought would also be important to investors. Customers, trustworthiness, clearly important here. Communities, equitable access. Who gets to access these technologies and who doesn't? In food systems, we had areas of value such as delivering reliable products, maintaining a reputation for being ethical and responsible. This is an interesting one. You're going to see this come back time and time again. To customers, quality products that deliver on their promise, and communities, safety of those products. Very important here if you're beginning to look at food systems and the whole history over the last 20 or 30 years around advanced technologies being applied to food systems. And then finally on this slide, biodiversity. Again, return on investment was highlighted, but also if you look at investors, the importance of socially and environmentally beneficial innovation with customers, investment in consumer communities, and in communities, social inclusivity and equity. So I highlight these because all of these are somewhat subjective, social or socially based risks that are often ignored in any strategic decision making and yet can completely scupper an enterprise if they're not thought about. So this was actually quite exciting, beginning to see these developed. And then the next stage, once we'd identified these areas of value, as I said, we asked people to match them with different orphan risks. And again, this is a very busy slide, and this is just from human health, but it gives you a sense of what this process is like, because it's a very visual process where we ask people to begin to actually match these icons associated with orphan risks with those areas of value. And again, I just want to sort of highlight the significance of this rather than going into the details. So what you see here is, if you look at this first line, you're looking at areas of value that these people felt were relevant to the enterprise and orphan risks that potentially threatened that value. So these are internal threats. They're things that an enterprise might do or might not be taking care of that actually threaten their ability to achieve success. But then you look at these other three rows. These are what you might call reciprocal threats. So these are orphan risks that are aligning with investor, customer, and community areas of value and potentially threaten those areas of value. But the key thing here is if an enterprise starts doing things that raises issues around ethics, it threatens agency, it threatens reputation and trust and a whole bunch of other things with these stakeholders, that then comes back and bites the enterprise. A smart enterprise will be minimizing the things that they do that threaten these areas of stakeholder value in order to open up pathways for success. If they ignore them, the chances are that those pathways to success are closed down. Now, here I should reiterate that this is all a set of perceived areas of value and orphan risks. It is not absolute, it is not objective, but again, it's this understanding within the minds of people that are actually developing these technologies of what that landscape might look like that changes the way of thinking about how to make strategic decisions. And that's what was important. So that was how we visualized the landscape. We then went on and did a further level of analysis in terms of risk clustering. So again, these are the data from just the human health workshop. And what you're seeing here is the relative number of times that each of these orphan risks was highlighted in the workshop in every context. So again, this is very, very subjective, but it gives a sense of how important the participants thought these were. And if you look at the right, I've highlighted at the top, I think it's 7 orphan risks here. This is important because in this particular context, you see at the top of the list is ethics. It isn't, will this technology kill people? Will it harm their health? It isn't, will it harm the environment? It isn't, will it lead to a loss of money? It's about the ethics of what are going on and how a disregard of ethics could potentially prevent the value of the enterprise being realized. Second, you have loss of agency. And third, health and environment, which actually gets to the more traditional stuff, but then you've got perception. So you're beginning to see a set of risks or set of things that people probably should be thinking about that don't usually appear in these risk assessments. We also have black swan events, which I'm going to come to in a second. So this is how we began to parse out the data that we had. You can begin to look at that across all 3 of the workshops. And again, an incredibly busy slide, but actually very rich in subjective information. And again, I've got to emphasize the subjectivity here. So what you're seeing here is each of the 18 orphan risks. You're seeing the relative frequency with which each of those risks was identified within a workshop for each of the 3 workshops, and then all workshops together. And it gives you a sense within these workshops and these participants of what they considered important versus not so important. So again, highlighting some of these. First of all, looking at the orphan risks that really stand out in terms of seeming to be important across each of the workshops. Again, ethics is very clearly there. It was actually quite surprising to us and actually very important that ethical considerations were considered to be really important in the success of these technologies, both internal to the enterprise, but also with respect to how that enterprise interacted with other stakeholders. We also saw that perception, or the perception of risks and benefits, was critical here. So it wasn't good enough just to have a great technology. That technology had to be seen as great within the eyes of critical stakeholders. And then, not surprisingly, we also saw governance and regulation highlighted as really important, making sure that both we have a solid governance and regulation landscape, but also enterprises and others understood how to navigate that successfully. And you can pick out other ones there. I just wanted to pick out those 3. But then you look at areas where there seemed to be quite a lot of difference between the workshops. And I've just picked out 3 of these orphan risks here: privacy, co-opted tech, and bad actors. And you can begin to see the utility of this in terms of identifying at a fairly granular level what is going to be important in one area of a technology innovation, such as biopreservation technologies, versus what is going to be less important. So privacy, not surprisingly, it was considered to be far more important in human health applications than it was in biodiversity. On the other hand, if you look at co-opted tech, the idea of some company taking what seems to be a good technology and giving it a bad name by using it in ways that people don't seem to consider to be appropriate was considered to be a fairly low issue or small issue in food systems, but incredibly important in biodiversity-based applications. And then similarly, bad actors who actually sort of start using these technologies for nefarious purposes very clearly flagged up in terms of human health and biodiversity as a potential risk. The one thing that I didn't highlight here that I actually wanted to highlight now is black swan events. And I didn't highlight it because these ended up being a catch-all, and the idea being that you have a potential risk which you just do not anticipate, or is very hard or nearly impossible to anticipate, that nevertheless pulls the rug from under your feet. And it was very clear from each of the workshops that this was a large concern to everybody there. Which is why it's so highlighted here. The challenge with black swan events is, by their very nature, they're not predictable. But what we have found is just being aware that there could be things coming down the pike that are likely to surprise you or blindside you, at least gives you the opportunity of beginning to think outside the box to how you might identify them and respond to them, which again is an important part of this process. So to wrap this up, what were the key takeaways from this? Well, the first one was that certainly from what we saw from this small set of workshops and small set of participants, anticipating, identifying, and navigating what you might call societal risks, orphan risks, is really highly relevant to the success of impact-focused research and engineering initiatives. And by that, I mean these initiatives that are not just about the research in the lab and the science, but they're all about having broad and scalable societal impact. And that includes, obviously, initiatives such as ATP-Bio, but we were very clear in this that extends to other similar initiatives, such as other NSF engineering research centers. Next, we found that as these participants began to look at this orphan risk landscape, the sorts of things that were highlighted as really needing awareness and attention were things such as ethics, perception, reputation and trust, and governance and regulation. This is really important to me because these are not technological risks. They're risks that are associated with the really deep complexity of socio-technical systems and actually trying to develop a technology within a system made up of people and different components of society. And this underlined the importance of really paying attention to these areas. Because otherwise, the indication was you can have the best technology in the world, but if you're not paying attention to these potential threats to value, you will not realize the value in that innovation. The third key takeaway was it seemed that risk innovation was a useful tool for revealing novel insights into the challenges and opportunities that we had here. And we weren't sure of this at the beginning because, as I said, this was a subjective, a qualitative tool developed for working with startups. But certainly through our experience, and I think there's a lot to learn still, it seemed like if you think about this as a way of helping people think differently and think in a more forward-looking way about the risk landscape they face, it was extremely effective. And in fact, we don't say too much about this in the paper because it is very, very subjective, but certainly in conversations with the people that were part of these workshops, we heard a number of times that just the process of going through this help them think differently about the risks that they faced and how to navigate them. And that, of course, is at the core of the risk innovation process. It's not about giving you a checklist of what to do, but it's about changing the way you think about the socio-technical risk and value landscape that you're actually developing things into so you can successfully navigate it. But of course, there is additional work to do here. This was really just a pilot study to see how useful this approach was, but certainly there were indications that this approach, this risk innovation approach, is something that could be further developed to work with broader stakeholder groups like this. So that's pretty much all I want to say here before we get to questions and conversation. Again, I did want to make sure that these acknowledgements were here, but I want to finish off with a final couple of thoughts. The first is, this isn't the perfect study. It doesn't give you a clear pathway to ensuring the success of a transformative new technology. But I think that it gives a fairly unique pathway to beginning to understand what some of the hidden risks are to success if millions, and in some cases billions of dollars, are being poured into a technology that intuitively feels like it should be good for society, but practically it runs into a lot of very complex roadblocks. And that is, I think, where the utility of this research comes in terms of helping a broad array of stakeholders, all the way from researchers to implementers and businesses, understand how to begin to navigate what is becoming an increasingly complex risk landscape. Thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to close this share screen and we will go to Q&A.
Thank you, Andrew. That was fantastic. I'm going to invite people to use the raise hand function, and I'll call on you for your questions. But I'd like to kick it off by asking you, Andrew, how far do you think we can push this approach? For example, when you think about ATP-Bio technology's potential to preserve organs for transplantation, prolonged preservation, and you think about some of the stakeholder groups there, patients, transplant surgeons, not cleanly organized into companies or discrete enterprises. What are your thoughts, though, about how we might be able to use this approach?
Yeah, great question. And I think I've got a couple of answers, and I'm thinking about sort of how closely they get together. So the first answer is, I think there's a lot of work to do, but I think there is the potential there in terms of developing this into a technique that can actually deal with the messiness of a complex stakeholder ecosystem. And we saw indications of that. But also, and as I'm saying this, there's a deep caveat here. And the caveat is, I think there's a temptation to make this quantitative, to say, here's a process that you go through and it'll give you all the answers of how to actually navigate this landscape. I do not think that that will work simply because of the messiness of these landscapes. And this is similar to what we found with working with startups. If you've got a messy and uncertain landscape, the best you can do is help people begin to think differently and develop an agility for how they actually navigate through this. So this is where I actually think this is a technique that does work very well in very complex situations. And yes, we had that sort of division out into those three stakeholder groups. There's no reason why you can't change those, why you can't have overlap between them. But if you approach this as a way of helping people think differently as they're making decisions on the fly and developing an agility for decision making, I think it can be very adaptable and really very powerful, as long as you don't get locked in to a really rigid methodology.
I have to confess that as we were running the workshops, I had moments myself as an individual where I thought, wow, I could use this to make decisions.
Right.
Okay, I'm seeing Ken and then Dr. Zaire. So Ken, you first.
Okay, is this audible, first of all?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so again, great job distilling a very massive amount of information, Andrew. I want to poke in with a question on whether your findings are unique to the specific technology, in
Yeah.
this case, cryopreservation. And I'm asking this question as someone who participated in another ERC, the synthetic biology ERC. The methods being used were different, but the technologies were also radically different
Yeah.
in terms of the potential for applications of SynBio having or posing existential risks to humanity and significant environment altering effects, species diversity in particular, especially if you're talking gene drives,
Yep.
or if you're talking societal implications, if you're talking about opiate synthesis with yeast, converting glucose to morphine and heroin. The consequences, not, okay, both have significant benefits, all right? And you're going to want to understand the benefits. On the risk side, I have to tell you, was the fact that, frankly, the downside awful possibilities may not be as great with cryopreservation.
Yep.
And
No,
that on the benefit side, many of the issues might be related to things like the plausibility of claims or whether you can write contracts with a degree of plausibility if people don't really know if it'll hold, or for that matter, a little bit on tort law and the possibility of injuries to third parties. But is cryopreservation more conventional than some of the other emerging technology areas? And to what extent are the findings shaded to a degree by that?
great question. And I think the answer is yes. Biopreservation technologies, I think, are very different in terms of that risk and value landscape to something like synthetic biology. But I think that some of the broader findings are still very, very relevant. So let me give you an example of that. So yes, with advanced biopreservation technologies, you have to push harder to think about those really big societal risks. But on the other hand, if you begin to think about risks to success and threats to value growth, you begin to think about things like the existing sort of insurance and reimbursement system, and how if you try and radically change that because you've got a transformative technology, you're going to have a massive system fighting back against you and preventing you from doing that. So this is a way of better understanding the complexity of that landscape between where you are now and the value that you can perceive. It's, as you said, very, very different if you look at synthetic biology, where people are triggered with different things. But again, the same process, I think, helps you understand some of the hidden barriers to success. And even in that case, you know very well the history of synthetic biology, where some of the research community effectively sort of self-destructed because of their lack of understanding of what they were doing. My sense is that a risk innovation approach based on value protection and value growth would help identify those areas where well-meaning researchers were shooting themselves in the foot because they refused to understand the broader landscape within which they're working. And the final thing I would say there is, certainly in our experience, this is a really adaptable approach. So we took a really big picture approach when we looked at ATP-Bio, but you could be very, very specific. So you could actually run this looking at the specific case of gene drives as a way of trying to understand sort of what the value-based risk landscape is around them. And you could apply it, I think, in very specific areas.
More to be
Great.
said, Andrew. Thank you, though. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Uzair?
Yes, thank you, Carla. And thank you, Dr. Maynard. That was a very enlightening presentation. I think it was very good. And I'm going to go on to say that if you formalize this technique, I think you're going to run a lot of potential book authors out of the industry, because there are a lot of people trying to write books about that and have written them and are trying to write them, I think. So with that, I actually have now two questions, but I'm going to ask the first main question. First is that tying it to ATP-Bio, how are you at a point where you could turn it into a small course a one-day course for ATP researchers, because I think what you're talking about is really the genesis of any business that wants to be successful, right? Really, somebody wants to, even a startup company, if I want to start a company, I got to understand all these risks, I think. That's really, if not the very first steps, probably one of the very first few steps that anybody should take before considering to start a business, which should be the, in a lot of cases, that would be the goal of a lot of research that's being done under ATP-Bio. So I'm like trying to see how this, whatever progress you have made in this, developing this technique, are you at a point, are you close to a point where it could turn into even just a day course or 3-hour course of some sort that could be offered?
Yep. So on that, the answer is absolutely yes, within the limitations of bandwidth. So we already have, if you go to the riskinnovation.org website, there are a set of resources there freely available and a set of training modules that are freely available. So you've got the bare bones of something. I would say that really needs to be developed up. So it's something that actually makes sense to sort of whoever is going to use it. That is not something that we're actively working on now, but everything is there for people or organizations that want to build this up very, very quickly into something that is concrete, that could be folded either into something like ATP-Bio or actually used in other situations.
Okay. Thank you for that.
And then there was a part 2.
Oh, I was just curious about, is that Spock and Kirk in the background, even though you try to blur it, but I can make out. You cannot
yes,
hide.
yes, it is. Yes, it is.
All right.
I'd like to build on Uzair's question for a second, Andrew. When we ran these workshops, I was really an observer when you and Marissa ran these workshops. They were at a moment in time early in development of ATP-Bio technologies. And I wonder your thoughts about the utility of this approach longitudinally.
Yeah.
Since now we're looking at the potential, hopefully, of renewal into a more translational phase. And it seems to me that our partners may evolve in their thinking, both on the value side and on the risk side. So how do you think about sort of repeat looks at these issues and what that might show?
That is such a great question because it feeds straight into our process. Thank you, Susan. So yes, to be successful, this has to be a continuous process because the landscape changes, thinking changes, ideal value creation areas change, and processes change. So the ideal, certainly to me, is this is a process that's applied in different iterations all the way from the conception stage of research and development, through deployment, through commercialization. And the way reason I said this sort of set me up was if you look at our early work in that 2-page risk innovation planner, the idea is that this is a simple process that a startup would go through every quarter because they know things change. And maybe things haven't changed, but at least it's either a reminder of where they're heading or it's an opportunity to actually tweak things and think about what the next steps are. So that was an integral part of the process. But I think applying it to something as big as an ERC, there would need to be a little bit more formalization in terms of how you continue that process through.
Yeah, I mean, my question is really motivated by the fact that I see huge potential myself for this to be applied. Uzair had a great idea, but also that it might, we have these, as I recall, 90-minute workshops. And if it were a bit more expanded in format, then people within a sector, could share their views and maybe move toward a consensus or collective view of what are we really trying to do in the health sphere or in the biodiversity sphere? And where do we as a group see the biggest threats?
Yep. No, I think that's exactly right. And one of the things I didn't mention, but is 90 minutes really wasn't enough. We could have had half day or even whole day sort of workshops and still been able to extract a lot of value from them. So just in the context of the renewal of ATP-Bio, I think there's tremendous potential to take the seed and to sort of grow it out and see where it goes.
Great. I see Jim Childress.
Andrew, thanks very much. That was a very clear and rich presentation, and I agree with the comments that have been made about that you made and echoed by others, that the process certainly is a very important part of it. Let me ask a question for clarification about how some of the buckets were understood. For example, the bucket of ethics.
Yes.
Obviously, it overlaps with others such as trustworthiness, and we could add others to that as well. But so what was the sort of basic understanding when people saw this as a value and a risk threat? What did they have in mind in the conversations that you were participating in?
Yeah, no, great question. And it begins to reveal some of the additional work that needs to be done. So the first thing I should say is all of this was down to the perception of the participants. So when they identified ethics as an orphan risk or as an issue, it was within their own idea of how that might upset progress, however they interpreted it. And I am pretty sure that every single person was thinking about a different thing when they thought about ethics. But the important thing was they realized that there was something about value sets among these stakeholders, and we're talking about values, plural here, that was going to be important to the decisions that were being made. And I think it was that raising of awareness in this particular instance that was important, no matter how they were interpreting ethics. I think, to your point, now we have these data, and once data are developed in similar situations, you could do a much deeper dive into trying to work out what people are thinking here and how you can maybe align their thinking to something which is more concrete and more actionable. Because again, I suspect a lot of the participants, ethics was a buzzword, but they didn't really know how to unpack that. So again, this is just a first step in beginning to understand where you go from here with that information.
Good point.
I do think, to follow up on Jim's question, that the fact that ethics, remarkably, was the most endorsed threat is really supportive of the idea that ERCs or an ERC like ATP-Bio does need an ethics and public policy component.
Yeah. And I just to add to that, Susan, because I mean, it would be easy for somebody to say we sort of primed them for that and we sort of pushed them in that direction. I don't think with our methodology we did. We basically sort of said there are things that you maybe aren't thinking about that are sort of down to how society and people behave that might be an issue. What do you think they are? And so I think that identification of ethics came from the participants rather than us steering them in that direction.
And I said nothing. I was observing.
You said yes, yes.
Lest anyone think I primed anybody, I was silent. Tim Tripp, how great to see you.
Yes, thank you, Susan. Great to see you too. Thanks, Andrew, very much. It's great to see all this work come together. We spent a great deal of time poring over this data together, so that's great. One thing I did want to add, is just to remind the audience and remind this group that, these were industry folks for the most part, with non-academic sort of appointments and positions and thinking in that way. And one thing that I don't want to underestimate or sort of not talk about is the power of this process to inform those individuals on how to deploy resources, right? So this is, I think, an absolutely critical component of this process, and what came out of this is, I think, back to the participants and sort of the things that were said in the meetings, and how using this process to think about my work and what I'm doing in a different way was an aha moment, I think, for several of the participants. So as now someone who has a group and has to deploy resources strategically in the confines of a budget, utilizing this approach and the outcome of it to help, determine my, the direction of my spending and my bosses, getting my bosses on board with what where we put our resources is, I think, important. And so I wanted to make sure to add that onto this last line of conversation. But I also, yeah, maybe if you want to comment on that, and I've just got one other thing.
No, I was just going to say, no, I think you're right on point there. And again, sort of this is a very, very flexible, fluid approach that can be used. Even back to what Susan was saying, everything from personal decision making to how you allocate resources to how you make strategic decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually feeds into my other comment that I wanted to kind of put in for this group's benefit is, we don't have to think about the highest sort of impact of the decisions that we're making and applying this approach to those decisions, immortal life or things like that. We can think about product line extensions or additions to small things that may seem trivial, but in a corporate environment, are very, very impactful to our market positions and our ability to move our products forward and gain more market share. Applying this methodology to those smaller decisions, I think makes a ton of sense as well. So I just wanted to add that one as well, and then thank you again, and thank you, Susan, for hosting.
No, thank you, Tim. And again, thanks for your contributions to this. I just want to add one thing to that, which I think is relevant here, but somewhat anecdotal. When we were working with startups and founders, one of the most important things we discovered was that this broke paralysis by analysis. So we would speak to a really well-meaning company that were doing something, and they were wringing their hands saying, we think that this might be good for society. We think it might sort of create unknown risks. We don't know what to do. And if they were left on their own, they could think of 1,001 ways in which their technology would crash society. And we very intentionally forced them to think about what are the 2 or 3 things that are important now. Not is this going to be the end of life as we know it, but what are the things you need in order to succeed over the next sort of 6, 12, 24 months. And that was critically important to breaking them out of that cycle of just imagining the worst.
Andrew, I wonder, as we near the end of this, if you could pan the camera out, if you will. And as you know, our ERC and our ethics and public policy component have been thinking a lot about the landscape of tools for stakeholder engagement. It's a big question, but where do you see this set of tools fitting in to that broader landscape?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that if this is used as part of a toolkit, it is just one out of many tools for stakeholder engagement. It doesn't work on its own. You've got to fit it into the whole integrated toolkit. And I think that that's important, so people don't think that this is either the way or the gold standard. Secondly, and this goes back to a lot of the conversation, I think with some development is a very powerful and very unique way for helping guide decisions and processes that are going to be more societally informed and more successful as a result. So certainly looking at the big picture, I would say that there is tremendous utility in taking what is here, what we've learned from this study, what exists around risk innovation, and building on it, repurposing it for specific situations. So now it becomes a really powerful toolkit, not only for the success of developing a new technology, but more importantly, doing it in a way that actually creates value across society rather than for a small sector. And this, I think, is a really important point to sort of begin to end on. We approach this very much from the position of the enterprise. How do you allow an enterprise to be successful? And in that way, it doesn't feel like it's about socially responsible or ethical innovation. Apart from the fact, if you think that in today's day and age, with the complexity of the world we're living in, if an enterprise doesn't think about building and creating social value, they are less likely to succeed. So to me, one of the really important points here is an approach like this allows you to actually take approaches to technology innovation that are socially responsible, socially beneficial, socially valuable. And that, to me, if that can be highlighted as a route to ensuring enterprise success and societal success simultaneously, that then becomes transformative.
Wonderful. Uzair, did you have a quick comment as we close?
Yeah, just a very quick comment. This only because selfishly I'm about to go to this meeting in November with ERC and NSF and all that. So part of that is that we're going to talk to some of the what we are contemplating having a little bit of a discussion with these researchers who might want to start a business. So how can IAB help, right, with that that sort of discussion. I'm wondering, these slides that you just shared, are they available for somebody like me who can, maybe learn something and kind of just as a memory jogger for me to potentially have some conversation around that when I'm going to see some researchers there?
Susan, I'm very happy for these slides to be circulated, but I think it's down to ATP-Bio.
Yes. Okay, we can work specifically with you, Uzair, and also with others interested. Also, as we close, I just want to remind everyone that the recording of this webinar, including Andrew's presentation and slides, we're going to put up, and we can send out the link, I think very rapidly, so that you can view the whole thing again. Andrew, I can't thank you enough for really an excellent presentation that's extremely timely. Uzair mentioned the site visit coming up in November, all of us thinking about these issues of engagement and the sort of bilateral learning that we can engage in as an ERC with partners, with stakeholders, with communities. I want everyone also to stay tuned because very shortly, the full 10-article symposium in the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics will be coming out. And thanks in part to wonderful support from John and Mehmet and Alyssa and the whole team, the entire issue will be open access. So it will be freely available, and we'll make sure that it reaches you. So again, many, many thanks. Andrew, I do think this is such a potent technology, and I hope the article is very widely read. Thank you for your presentation today. And thanks
Thank you.
to everyone for great comments and questions.
Thank you, Andrew. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
This has been a pleasure.